Most of the choices you make today will not feel like choices at all. They will feel like conclusions, arriving fully formed, and you will rarely notice the machinery behind them. That machinery has names, quiet models for how a mind actually decides, invented across centuries by economists chasing bad bets, generals planning campaigns, psychologists running rigged card games, and one New York delicatessen owner who noticed something odd about which Broadway shows kept running long after they opened. This is a list built from that scattered history, 45 of the sturdiest patterns anyone has managed to name, told slowly enough to sit with each one before the next arrives. Some of these models will describe a mistake you have already made this week, without knowing its name. A few will describe a mistake you are about to make tomorrow. None of them are tricks to perform on other people, and none of them promise a shortcut to being right more often. What they offer instead is smaller and steadier, a way of noticing the shape of a decision before you are all the way inside it. There is no need to memorize any of this, and there will be no test at the end. Settle in. We have the time, and the models, whatever else they are, have already been running your decisions for years without asking your permission. It seems only fair that you finally get to meet them. Losing $10 hurts roughly twice as much as finding $10 feels good. That lopsided arithmetic was measured carefully in the late 1970s by two psychologists, Dan Yule K8 and A.Y. Mose TVR Ski, working through a long series of simple gambles with ordinary people. Ask someone to choose between a certain $50 and a coin flip for either $100 or nothing, and most will take the certain money, even though the expected value is identical. Frame the same gamble as a loss instead of a gain, and people reverse course entirely, suddenly willing to take the risk just to avoid a certain loss. Kahneman and Tversky called this asymmetry loss aversion, and it turned out to be one of the sturdiest findings in the whole discipline of behavioral economics, replicated across cultures, income levels, and decades of follow-up studies. It explains why an investor holds a falling stock long after the sober case for selling has arrived, because selling converts a paper loss into a real one, and the mind treats that conversion like an injury. It explains why a shopper will drive across town to save $15 on a $100 purchase, but not on a $1,000 one, even though the $15 is identical either way, because the loss of the discount gets measured against the size of the deal rather than against 15 actual dollars. It explains negotiation tables where a small concession, once offered, becomes almost impossible to withdraw, because withdrawing it registers to the other side as a loss rather than the simple cancellation of a gain that was never guaranteed. None of this requires a person to be foolish or uninformed. The asymmetry sits upstream of reasoning, in the same old machinery that once made it sensible for a hungry animal to fear losing a meal. It already had more than it hoped for a meal it did not yet have. The modern world offers far more gambles than the ancestral one ever did, and the old asymmetry has not caught up. It just keeps voting, in every choice, against the smaller number on the losing side of the ledger. Picture a couple who bought 2 non-refundable tickets to an outdoor concert months in advance, and on the night itself a cold rain begins to fall just as they are leaving the house. A rational calculation would ask only one question. Given the rain, would they rather go to the concert or stay home, treating the ticket price as already spent and irrelevant to tonight's decision? Almost nobody asks the question that cleanly. Instead, they think about the money already gone, and the thought of wasting it pulls them out into the rain they would otherwise have avoided. Economists call this the sunk cost fallacy, and it shows up far past concert tickets. A restaurant diner who ordered too much food will keep eating well past comfort, not because the food is still good, but because leaving it feels like throwing money away twice. A company that has poured 2 years and a large budget into a product nobody wants will often fund a 3rd year rather than admit the first 2 were a loss, because stopping makes the loss final and visible in a way that continuing does not. Governments have justified extending unsuccessful wars and unsuccessful infrastructure projects with almost exactly this reasoning, treating the lives and money already spent as a debt that continuing can somehow repay, when in fact continuing can only spend more. The fallacy persists because stopping requires a moment of open admission that a choice was wrong, while continuing lets that admission stay comfortably deferred. The only real fix, and it is a difficult one, is to ask the couple's question honestly, given only where things stand right now, ignoring everything already spent, would this still be the choice worth making? Most of the time, the past spending was never the deciding vote at all, only the excuse for a decision the present moment had already made on its own. What happens in the half-second after someone names the first price in a negotiation? Kahneman and Tversky answered that question with a simple, almost mischievous experiment. They spun a wheel rigged to land on either a low number or a high number, then asked participants an unrelated question about the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. People who had just seen the wheel land on a low number guessed low. People who saw it land on a high number guessed high. The wheel had nothing to do with the United Nations, and everyone knew that, yet the number still leaked into the estimate. This is anchoring, and it is one of the most reliably reproduced effects in all of psychology. Real estate agents exploit it by listing a home slightly above its expected value, because buyers will negotiate down from that number rather than up from a fair one, and the final sale price tends to land higher than it would have if the listing had started low. Salary negotiations run the same way, which is why career advice so often insists on naming a number first rather than waiting to be asked, since whichever number arrives first quietly sets the gravity for everything that follows. Courtroom sentencing has shown the same pattern in studies where judges, after being shown an arbitrary and clearly irrelevant number, handed down sentences that drifted toward it. The anchor does not have to be reasonable, relevant, or even remembered consciously to do its work. It only has to arrive first. Everything that comes after gets measured, however unfairly, against a number nobody chose on purpose. During the Second World War, the United States military studied its bomber planes that returned from missions, mapping every bullet hole across the fuselage, wings, and tail. The natural instinct was to reinforce the areas showing the most damage, since those were clearly the parts getting hit. A statistician named Abraham Wald, working with a research group at Columbia University, argued the exact opposite. The planes being studied were the ones that made it back. The bullet holes marked on them showed where a plane could be hit and still fly home. The planes that mattered most, the ones hit somewhere else entirely, were sitting at the bottom of the ocean or scattered across enemy territory, and they were never part of the sample at all. Wald's recommendation was to reinforce the areas with the fewest hits on returning planes, because those were the spots where a hit reliably meant the plane never returned to be counted. This is survivorship bias, drawing conclusions from a sample that has already been filtered by the very outcome being studied. It shows up constantly outside aviation. Business books study companies that succeeded and extract lessons from their habits without ever looking at the far larger pile of companies that failed doing exactly the same things. A grandparent's story about smoking 3 packs a day and living to 90 says nothing about the far greater number of equally heavy smokers who did not survive to tell any story at all. The wreckage that never gets studied is not a small gap in the data. In cases like Wald's bombers, it is the whole answer, sitting quietly outside the frame of whatever got counted. People do not generally search for the truth about a contested question. They search for evidence that the answer they already suspect is the right one, and they find it with suspicious ease. This is confirmation bias, one of the most studied and most stubborn tendencies in human reasoning. Ask someone convinced of a particular political or medical claim to research it, and they will overwhelmingly click on sources that agree with them. Read those sources more carefully and remember them more vividly, while sources that disagree get skimmed, discounted, or simply forgotten. The bias operates in 3 separate stages: what gets searched for, what gets believed once found, and what gets remembered afterward, and it can distort all 3 even in someone with no intention of being unfair. Classic laboratory work in the 1960s, notably Peter Wayson's studies on rule testing, found that people testing a hypothesis chose to look for cases that would confirm it rather than cases that could disprove it, even when disproof would have been the far more informative test. The bias is not really about intelligence. Highly educated people show it just as strongly as anyone else, sometimes more strongly because they are better equipped to construct sophisticated justifications for a conclusion they had already reached before they started looking. The one thing that reliably interrupts the pattern is deliberately searching for the strongest argument against a belief rather than for it, a habit that takes real effort precisely because it runs against what the search feels naturally inclined to find. 2 people can read the identical article and each walk away more certain than before, having found, in the very same words, exactly what they were already looking for. A traveller will often feel more anxious about a plane crash than about the car ride to the airport, despite the drive being, mile for mile, far more dangerous by any measure. Ask why, and the honest answer is rarely statistical. It is that plane crashes are rare, dramatic, and heavily covered when they happen, while car crashes are common, quiet, and barely reported at all unless they involve someone famous. Kahneman and Tversky named this the availability heuristic. People judge how likely something is by how easily an example of it comes to mind, rather than by its actual frequency. Vivid, emotional, recently reported events come to mind easily, and so get overestimated. Common, unremarkable, statistically larger risks stay quiet in memory and get underestimated in turn. This explains spikes in public fear after a widely covered violent crime, even in years when overall crime rates are falling, because the coverage makes the rare case feel close and frequent. It explains why people overestimate the risk of shark attacks and underestimate the risk of drowning in a swimming pool, since one produces dramatic footage and the other rarely makes the news at all. News organizations do not need to lie to produce this distortion. They only need to report what is unusual, which is the very nature of news, and the unusual event then colonizes the part of the mind responsible for judging what is likely. The heuristic is not a flaw limited to anxious or uninformed people. It is simply what happens when a mind, lacking a spreadsheet of actual frequencies, reaches instead for whatever image arrives first, and mistakes its vividness for its likelihood. What does a free afternoon actually cost? Nothing appears on any receipt, and yet economists insist the afternoon is never free, because choosing to spend it one way means giving up every other way it could have been spent. This is opportunity cost, one of the oldest and most quietly ignored ideas in economics. A student who spends 4 years and considerable money earning a degree is not only paying tuition, they are also giving up 4 years of income they could have earned working instead, and that foregone income is every bit as real a cost as the tuition bill, even though it never appears on any invoice. A business that keeps a talented employee in a role they have outgrown pays no visible cost at all, yet it may be quietly losing the far larger value that employee could have created somewhere else in the company, or the cost of losing them to a competitor who offers that better role instead. The reason opportunity cost is so easy to ignore is structural rather than a failure of attention. The option chosen is visible and countable, while the option given up is invisible, hypothetical, and unmeasured by anything. A person can point to the vacation they took, but nobody can point to the vacation they did not take instead, or the savings that money could have become. Economists have a habit, useful outside economics too, of asking what the next best alternative was before praising or blaming any decision, because a choice that looks generous or wise on its own can look considerably less so once measured against everything it quietly displaced. A city facing a housing shortage decides to cap how much landlords are allowed to raise rent, and in the short run, tenants in existing apartments breathe easier, which is exactly the first-order effect anyone would expect and celebrate. But a cap on future rent increases also lowers the expected return on building new housing, and developers, weighing where else to put their money, quietly build less of it than they would have otherwise. Years later, the same city facing its original shortage now faces a worse one, having addressed the visible first effect while creating an invisible second effect that undid much of the good. This is the trap that second-order thinking is built to catch, judging a decision only by its immediate, easily observed consequence, while the consequence of that consequence, and the one after that, unfolds unseen and unaccounted for. A parent who gives a child money every time the child complains solves the immediate complaint, and also teaches the child that complaining reliably produces money, a second-order lesson that will keep generating first-order complaints for years. A company that lays off staff to hit this quarter's profit target improves this quarter's numbers, and also strips out the institutional knowledge and morale that next year's numbers were quietly depending on. None of this argues against ever acting on a first effect. It argues for pausing deliberately to ask what happens after the thing that happens first, because most bad decisions were not badly reasoned at the first domino. They simply stopped counting dominoes one tile too soon. The 19th century mathematician Carl Jakob Oshby kept a private motto he returned to whenever a problem resisted him head-on. Invert, always invert. Rather than asking how to solve the problem directly, he asked what would guarantee that the problem stayed unsolved. and worked backward from there. The habit, called inversion, has quietly outlived the mathematics it was coined for. Instead of asking how to build a successful business, inversion asks what would reliably destroy one, and then works to avoid every item on that second, easier-to-generate list. Instead of asking how to have a good marriage, it asks what behaviors reliably ruin one: contempt, dishonesty, neglect, and treats simply avoiding those as most of the job already done. The technique works because failure is often far easier to enumerate than success. There are countless specific ways for a bridge to fail, and engineers spend most of their design effort closing off those specific ways, rather than trying to positively imagine every condition under which the bridge succeeds. The investor Charlie Munger, a longtime advocate of the technique, used to point out that it is much easier to know what to avoid than to know exactly what to seek, since avoidable disasters share recognizable shapes while unique successes rarely repeat their conditions exactly. Inversion does not replace forward planning. It runs alongside it, a second pass through the same decision from the opposite direction, catching the obvious wrecks that a mind focused entirely on winning tends to overlook, simply because it was never looking for them in the first place. A retired mechanic sits down with a friend's stock portfolio and, out of politeness, offers an opinion on a biotechnology company he does not understand, a currency he has never traded, and a merger he read about once in passing. He would never do the equivalent with an engine, because with an engine he knows exactly what he knows and exactly where his knowledge runs out. The investor Warren B. Buffett has spent decades making almost the same point about markets: the size of a person's circle of competence, the area they genuinely understand well enough to judge with confidence, matters far less than knowing precisely where that circle's edge sits. Buffett and his longtime partner, Charlie Munger, built an entire investing philosophy around staying inside a deliberately narrow circle, refusing well-regarded opportunities in industries they admitted they did not understand, even when those industries went on to do very well for other people. The discipline is uncomfortable because it means passing on genuine chances, and it means admitting ignorance out loud in exactly the moments when confidence feels most rewarded. Most costly decisions do not come from acting stupidly inside an area of real expertise. They come from acting confidently just outside it, in the fog past the edge of the circle, where a person's actual knowledge quietly runs out, but their willingness to have an opinion does not. Expanding the circle honestly, through real study, is always available. Pretending it is already larger than it is the mistake that cost money, reputations, and occasionally engines. Why does a doctor hearing hoofbeats outside a hospital window reach first for the diagnosis of a horse rather than a zebra? The reasoning behind that old medical saying traces back centuries further, to a 14th century English friar named William Occams, who argued that among competing explanations that fit the same evidence equally well, the explanation requiring the fewest additional assumptions deserves preference. The principle became known as Occam's razor, a tool for shaving away unnecessary complexity, rather than a guarantee of finding truth. A car that will not start is far more likely to have a dead battery than a rare electrical fault involving 3 separate components failing at once, even though the rare fault is not impossible. A friend's unanswered text is far more likely explained by a busy afternoon than by a sudden falling out, even though the falling out cannot be ruled out entirely. The razor works because complex explanations require more conditions to all be true simultaneously, and each additional required condition is another chance for the whole explanation to be wrong. Scientists lean on the same logic when choosing between competing theories that explain the same observations, favoring the one with fewer moving parts as the safer bet until new evidence demands the complexity. Occam's razor has never claimed the simple explanation always wins. It claims only that the simple explanation should be tested first, since it is cheaper to rule out, and because the mind's appetite for elaborate stories tends to outrun the actual evidence available to support them. A colleague fails to reply to an important email for 3 days, and by the second day a story has already formed. They are avoiding the topic, they are annoyed, they are punishing some earlier disagreement on purpose. On the 4th day the colleague apologizes, explaining that their inbox had simply been buried under an unrelated crisis, and the email never registered as urgent. This gap, between the hostile story a mind reaches for first, and the far more boring explanation that usually turns out to be true is exactly what a popular maxim known as Hanlon's razor is built to close. Attributed to a man named Robert Hanlon in a 1980 jokebook submission, though the sentiment is far older, the razor advises never attributing to malice what is adequately explained by simple carelessness. The habit matters because assuming hostile intent changes how a person responds, often escalating a misunderstanding into a genuine conflict that a moment of patience would have avoided entirely. Workplace friction runs on this exact fuel. A terse reply gets read as contempt rather than exhaustion. A missed invitation gets read as exclusion rather than an honest oversight, and each side's defensive response then supplies the other side with fresh evidence for the hostile story they had already decided was true. None of this means malice never exists, and the razor is not a rule to apply blindly when a pattern of genuine hostility has already been established through repeated behavior. It is a default setting for the first read of an ambiguous moment, a cheap correction against a mind that reaches for the more dramatic explanation before it has bothered to check whether the boring one already explains everything. In 1896, the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto was studying land ownership records and noticed something oddly consistent. Roughly 80% of the land belonged to roughly 20% of the population. Curious whether the ratio was a coincidence of Italian history, he checked other countries and found similar proportions recurring again and again. The pattern, later named the Pareto principle, turned out to describe far more than land. In business, a small share of clients often generates the large majority of revenue, and a small share of products often generates the large majority of complaints. In software, a small share of code paths is often responsible for the large majority of crashes, which is why engineers focus disproportionate attention on fixing those few paths rather than spreading effort evenly across the whole program. In a closet, small share of clothes accounts for the large majority of what actually gets worn, with the rest hanging quietly unused for years. The ratio is never exactly 80 and 20 in any of these cases, and Pareto never claimed a precise universal law. What recurs instead is the shape, a lopsided distribution where a minority of causes accounts for a majority of effects, appearing across systems that have nothing else in common. The practical use of the principle is not to chase mathematical precision, but to ask, before spreading effort evenly across everything, which small slice of causes is quietly doing most of the actual work, and to notice how often that slice turns out to be far smaller than intuition expects. A golfer has the best round of their life on a Saturday morning, and their friends, watching the following weekend, are almost guaranteed to see a round closer to their usual average, not because anything changed about their swing, but because Saturday's round was an outlier, and outliers are, by definition, unusual. This pattern, called regression to the mean, is one of the oldest and most misunderstood ideas in statistics, first described by the Victorian scientist Francis Galton while studying the heights of parents and their children. Galton noticed that unusually tall parents tended to have children slightly shorter than themselves, and unusually short parents tended to have children slightly taller, with each generation drifting gently back toward the population's average height. The same drift shows up whenever a result is partly caused by skill and partly caused by luck. An extreme performance almost always contains some lucky component, and luck, unlike skill, does not repeat itself on command, so the next performance tends to look more ordinary. The trouble is that people routinely mistake this statistical drift for a real cause and effect. A coach who yells at a player after an unusually bad performance sees the player's next performance improve and credits the yelling, when the improvement was likely coming anyway, purely from the mathematics of extremes settling back toward average. A company that fires its worst performing team after one disastrous quarter sees the replacement team perform better and calls it proof the firing worked, when a merely average quarter was the statistically expected outcome regardless of who was in the room. Regression to the mean does not explain everything, but it quietly explains far more of what gets credited to punishment, reward, and intervention than most people ever suspect. Suppose a disease affects one person in 1,000, and a test for it is 95% accurate. A patient tests positive. What is the actual chance they have the disease? Most people, including many doctors surveyed in classic studies, guess something close to 95%. The real answer, once the arithmetic is worked through honestly, is closer to 2% because the test's 5% false positive rate, applied across the enormous number of healthy people who take the test, produces far more false alarms than true cases, given how rare the disease actually is to begin with. This gap between intuition and arithmetic is called base rate neglect, the tendency to focus entirely on the vivid new evidence, the positive test, while ignoring the background frequency, the base rate, that the evidence needs to be weighed against. The error is not really about mathematical ability. Highly trained physicians have made exactly this mistake in controlled studies, because a positive test result feels emotionally loud and immediate, while a background statistic about disease prevalence feels abstract and easy to set aside. The same neglect appears outside medicine constantly. A single alarming news story about a security threat gets weighed as though it applies broadly, without asking how common the underlying threat actually is across the full population it is drawn from. Judges assessing risk, employers screening candidates, and ordinary people assessing a stranger's trustworthiness all fall into the identical trap, mistaking one loud piece of evidence for the whole picture, and forgetting to ask what the quiet, unglamorous denominator underneath it actually was. A traveller using a subway map to navigate a city could be forgiven for thinking the stations sit exactly where the map draws them, evenly spaced, neatly aligned, forming clean geometric lines across the page. Walk the actual streets above those tunnels and the real geography turns out to be far messier, full of curves, hills, and distances the map simplified away for the sake of being readable. The philosopher and scientist Alfred Korzybski coined a phrase for this gap in the 1930s. The map is not the territory. Every description of reality, no matter how careful, is a simplified stand-in for the far more complicated reality it represents, and the simplification is not a flaw, so much as the whole reason maps are useful at all. The trouble starts when the simplification gets mistaken for the thing itself. A company's org chart shows tidy reporting lines, but the actual flow of influence and decision-making inside the building rarely follows those lines cleanly, and a manager who only ever consults the chart will miss where the real power and real friction actually sit. A resume is a map of a career, condensed to a page, and a hiring decision made purely from that map can miss enormous undocumented parts of the territory it was drawn from. Financial models are maps of an economy built from equations, useful for thinking clearly, dangerous the moment their designers forget that the real economy, full of people behaving unpredictably, was never going to hold perfectly still long enough to match the model's clean lines. Every map earns its keep by leaving things out. The risk begins only when its user forgets what and how much got left out to make it readable. In an essay written in the early 20th century, the writer G.K. Chesterton described two kinds of reformer walking past an old fence standing in the middle of a field, for no reason either of them could see. The first reformer, seeing no purpose, concludes the fence should be torn down at once. The second reformer insists on finding out why the fence was built before touching it, reasoning that a fence built by someone with a purpose in mind should not be removed by someone who has not yet discovered what that purpose was. Chesterton clearly preferred the second reformer, and the principle now called Chestertons fence has become a standing caution against confident demolition of anything whose original reason has simply been forgotten rather than shown to be wrong. A new manager arriving at a company and finding an oddly slow approval process might reasonably assume the process is pointless bureaucracy, and might be right, or might discover, on closer inspection, that the process exists because of a costly mistake years earlier that nobody bothered to explain to the newcomer. Traditions, laws, and old habits often look exactly like Chesterton's fence to an outsider. Purposeless, inconvenient, ready for removal. Some of them genuinely are outdated and should go. Others are quietly load-bearing, holding up something the outsider has not yet noticed because it has never failed in front of them. The principle does not argue against ever tearing anything down. It argues only for finding out first, since the cost of understanding a fence is nearly always smaller than the cost of discovering, after removing it, exactly what it had been keeping out. A hospital administrator, under pressure to reduce how long patients wait to be seen, sets a clear target for average waiting time and celebrates when the number drops within a month. A closer look reveals that patients are now waiting the same amount of time overall, but a portion of that wait has simply been moved into the ambulance parked outside, or into a corridor before the official clock starts running. so the measured number improves while the actual patient experience does not. The British economist Charles Goodhart observed something similar happening with monetary policy in the 1970s and offered a warning that has since outgrown economics entirely. Any measure that becomes the explicit target people are managed toward tends to stop reliably measuring the thing it was originally meant to represent. A school judged purely on standardized test scores will often see those scores rise, while genuine understanding among students stays flat or even falls, because teaching narrows toward whatever the test rewards rather than toward learning broadly. A call center measured purely on how quickly calls end will see call times drop while customer problems increasingly go unresolved, because ending the call quickly, not solving the problem, is what is actually being counted and rewarded. Goodhart's law does not argue against measurement itself, since unmeasured systems drift in their own unaccountable directions too. It argues for suspicion toward any single number treated as the whole truth about a complicated goal, because the moment people are rewarded for the number rather than for the goal, they will, quite rationally, start managing the number instead. In 1999, 2 Cornell researchers gave volunteers tests of grammar, logic, and humor, then asked each volunteer to guess how well they had scored relative to everyone else in the room. The volunteers who scored in the bottom quarter consistently guessed they had scored well above average, while the volunteers who scored in the top quarter, oddly, guessed only slightly above average, underselling themselves. The finding became known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, popularly summarized as the least skilled being the most confident, and it spread quickly beyond psychology into everyday conversation, as shorthand for anyone speaking with more certainty than their actual knowledge could support. The honest story is more complicated than the popular shorthand suggests. Statisticians later showed that a meaningful portion of the original gap can be reproduced through a purely mathematical illusion, related to regression toward the average, that would appear in the data even if nobody's self-perception were biased at all, simply because extreme scores in any noisy measurement tend to be paired with less extreme guesses. Researchers still argue, in ongoing published exchanges, over how much of the original effect survives once that mathematical illusion is accounted for, and how much reflects a genuine psychological blind spot in people who lack the very expertise needed to judge their own performance accurately. What survives the argument either way is the underlying intuition that recognizing incompetence usually requires some of the competence being judged, which is exactly why a true beginner in any field so often cannot yet see how much they do not know, while an expert, surrounded daily by the field's genuine difficulty, tends to remain quietly aware of how much further there always is to go. A retired British naval historian named Sir Northcote Parkin's son, writing for a magazine in 1955, opened an essay with an observation drawn from years spent watching civil service bureaucracies at close range. Work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. He illustrated the point with a story of an elderly woman with all day free who could spend an entire afternoon writing and posting a single postcard, agonizing over word choice and stamp selection in a way a busy person would never have time to indulge. The same law shows up in far more ordinary settings. A report given 2 weeks to write will, almost without exception, take nearly the full 2 weeks, while the identical report given only 2 days will somehow get finished in 2 days, at a similar level of quality, simply because the available time itself shapes how much fussing, revising and delaying feels permissible. Students report the same pattern with study time before an exam, and professionals report it with any task lacking a hard external deadline. Parkinson's original essay was aimed specifically at bureaucracies, where he further observed that the number of officials in a government department tended to grow at a fairly steady rate, regardless of how much actual work the department had to do, since officials, once hired, reliably found ways to generate work sufficient to justify hiring still more officials beneath them. The broader lesson has outlasted the specific bureaucratic target. A deadline is not merely a limit on a task. It is quietly one of the main things determining how large the task turns out to feel. A renovation contractor promises a kitchen will be finished in 6 weeks. It finishes in 11. This is not on its own a story about a dishonest contractor. Studies of major infrastructure projects across dozens of countries have found that the majority run over both their time and their budget estimates, sometimes by staggering margins, and the pattern holds regardless of how experienced the planners were or how much they genuinely wanted the estimate to be accurate. Kahneman and Tversky named this the planning fallacy and traced it to a specific reasoning error. When people estimate how long their own specific project will take, they build the estimate almost entirely from an inside view, imagining the steps of this particular project going roughly as planned, while barely consulting an outside view, the actual track record of how similar past projects have gone. The inside view feels more relevant precisely because it is more detailed and personal, full of the specific plans a person can already picture clearly. The outside view feels less relevant because it is abstract, drawn from other people's projects rather than this one, even though it is almost always the far more reliable predictor. A newlywed couple, estimating how their marriage will differ from the general divorce statistics, is running the identical inside view reasoning, as is a startup founder who has read the failure rate for new businesses and remains confident theirs will be the exception. The fix that researchers have found actually works is uncomfortable but simple. Before estimating a new project's timeline, look first at how long comparable projects have taken in the past, and let that outside number anchor the estimate, however much it deflates the optimism the inside view was so eager to supply. Offer someone $100 today or $110 in a month, and a large share will take the $100 right now, even though waiting a single month for a 10% return is, by almost any financial measure, an excellent deal. Offer the same person $100 in 12 months or $110 in 13 months, and most will happily wait the extra month for the larger amount, since neither reward is available soon enough to feel urgent. The inconsistency reveals something specific about how the mind values time. The discount applied to a future reward is not steady the way a simple interest rate would be. It drops sharply for anything happening in the very near future and levels for anything happening further out, a pattern economists call hyperbolic discounting. This explains why a person who genuinely intends to save for retirement and who would gladly commit to saving starting next year keeps finding reasons to spend rather than save this particular month, because this month's spending is close enough to feel vivid and urgent, while retirement remains comfortably abstract. It explains the gap between a smoker's sincere long-term wish to quit and their immediate reach for a cigarette in a stressful moment, since the immediate craving is weighted by the mind's steep near-term discount, while the long-term health cost sits far off in the shallow, easily ignored part of the curve. Financial products like automatic payroll deductions for retirement savings work specifically by removing the near-term decision entirely, since the near term is exactly where the discounting is steepest and willpower is least reliable. The future self who will actually receive the larger reward is, in an important sense, a stranger being negotiated with on behalf of a present self who consistently prefers to keep the money close. In a well-known series of experiments, researchers gave one group of participants a simple coffee mug and asked how much money they would need to be paid to give it up. A separate group, who had never owned the mug, was asked how much they would pay to acquire one just like it. The two groups were looking at the identical object, yet the owners consistently demanded roughly twice as much to part with their mug as the non-owners were willing to pay for one. Nothing about the mug had changed. Only ownership had, and ownership alone was enough to inflate its perceived value. Economists Richard Teller, Daniel Kahneman, and Jack Neksch, who ran these studies in the 1990s, named the pattern the Endowment Effect, and it has since been reproduced with objects ranging from pens to concert tickets to, in real estate markets, entire houses. A homeowner selling a house they raised a family in will frequently list it well above what an unattached buyer, weighing only the house's features against comparable listings, would consider a fair price because the seller's asking price is quietly shaped by memories the buyer has no access to and no reason to pay for. The effect also colours opinions and beliefs a person has held for a long time, since giving up a long-held view can feel, structurally, like giving up something owned, triggering the same reluctance the coffee mug studies measured directly. None of this means ownership makes something objectively better. It only means that the moment something becomes ours, whether a mug, a house, or an opinion, the price we quietly attach to keeping it stops being about the thing itself and starts being about the loss of no longer having it. Why do two restaurants on the same street, serving similar food at similar prices, so often end up with wildly different numbers of customers, one bustling every night and the other nearly empty. Diners walking past rarely have detailed information about either kitchen's quality. What they do have is a clear, visible signal. One restaurant is full of other people who apparently chose to eat there, and the other is not. That visible crowd becomes evidence in itself, sometimes stronger evidence than anything a menu or a review could offer, because it suggests that other people, faced with the identical choice, already investigated and decided. This is social proof, the tendency to treat the observed behavior of others as a reliable guide in situations where the right answer is unclear. Classic conformity research from the 1950s, including Solomon Asch line length experiments, found that a striking share of participants would give an answer they could privately see was wrong, simply because every other person in the room working from the same script had already given that same wrong answer aloud first. Modern commerce has built entire strategies around the same instinct. Testimonials, follow accounts, bestseller labels, and long lines outside a shop all function as manufactured crowds, offering the same reassuring signal that a genuine crowd would offer, whether or not the underlying quality actually earns it. The unsettling part of social proof is that it can become entirely self-referential, with each person's choice based only on the choices of the people just ahead of them, and nobody in the chain necessarily possessing any independent information at all. A full restaurant built, sometimes, on nothing sturdier than the fact that it looked full an hour earlier. A stranger at an airport hands a passerby a small paper flower and, before the passerby can politely refuse or return it, asks for a donation to an unfamiliar cause. Studies of exactly this scenario, run by groups seeking donations in the 1970s, found that the unsolicited gift, however small and unwanted, measurably increased how much money strangers were willing to give afterward, even when they tried to discard the flower moments later. Anthropologists studying cultures across the world have found some version of this obligation nearly everywhere they have looked. A gift given, even one neither requested nor particularly wanted, creates a felt debt in the receiver, and that debt tends to get repaid at a value disproportionate to what was actually given. This is the rule of reciprocity, and it likely persists across cultures because a species that shares food, tools, and favours survives better than one whose members keep score too tightly in the moment, so an instinct toward repaying kindness, even unequally, was worth carrying forward. The rule gets used deliberately in commerce and negotiation constantly. Free samples in a grocery store are not primarily there to inform a shopper about the product's taste. They are there to open a small debt that a subsequent purchase quietly repays. A negotiator who makes an early, seemingly generous concession is often not being generous at all, but rather opening the same account, expecting a concession of comparable or greater size in return later in the discussion. None of this makes reciprocity dishonest by nature, since genuine gift-giving between friends runs on the identical instinct and asks for nothing calculated in return. It only means that the warm feeling of an unearned gift is worth noticing for what it is quietly doing, well before the bill for it ever arrives. Researchers in California in the early 1960s asked homeowners for a small, easy favour: would they display a tiny sign in their front window supporting safe driving? Most agreed without much thought, since the request cost almost nothing. Weeks later, a different researcher returned and asked an entirely different, much larger favour of the same homeowners. Would they allow a large, unattractive billboard to be installed on their front lawn for the same cause? Homeowners, who had agreed to the small window sign weeks earlier, were dramatically more likely to agree to the large billboard than homeowners approached with the billboard request cold, having never been asked the small favour first. Psychologist Aurobert Cialdini, studying results like these, named the underlying pattern commitment and consistency. Once a person has taken even a small public stance on something, they feel a genuine pull to act in ways that stay consistent with that earlier stance, because reversing course would mean admitting the earlier commitment was not sincere. The pattern is used deliberately and constantly in sales and persuasion, structured as a sequence of small, easy agreements that build toward a much larger request the target would likely have refused if asked cold at the very start. Sign-up forms that begin with an easy, low-stakes question before working toward a purchase are exploiting exactly this sequence, as are salespeople trained to secure a series of small verbal agreements before ever naming a price. The mechanism is not really about being persuaded by new evidence at each step. It is about a person quietly defending the version of themselves who already agreed once, and finding it easier to keep agreeing than to explain, even to themselves, why they would suddenly stop. In a classic set of studies from the 1970s, researchers showed participants photographs of strangers rated in advance for physical attractiveness, then asked the participants to guess, from the photograph alone, how intelligent, kind, and successful each stranger was likely to be. The strangers rated more attractive were consistently judged more intelligent, more kind, and more successful too, despite the participants having no actual information about any of those qualities beyond a single photograph. Psychologist E.D. Ward Thorndike had described a version of this pattern decades earlier, coining the term halo effect, after noticing that soldiers rated highly by their commanding officers on one trait, such as physical bearing, were also rated unusually well on entirely unrelated traits, as though one bright quality had cast a glow over everything else about the person. The effect quietly shapes decisions that people believe they are making on pure merit. Job interviewers, research has repeatedly shown, rate taller and more conventionally attractive candidates as more competent and more suitable for leadership, independent of the candidate's actual qualifications, which have not been examined any more closely than the photograph strangers were shown. Jurors in mock trial studies have rated more attractive defendants as less likely to have committed the crime they were accused of, and judges handing down real sentences have, in several studies, given measurably lighter sentences to more attractive defendants for comparable offences. The halo effect does not require anyone involved to consciously believe attractiveness and virtue are related. It only requires the glow of one favourable trait to arrive first, before any of the other qualities have actually been examined, leaving little room for the examination to happen honestly at all. A driver cuts sharply into your lane without signalling, and the immediate, almost automatic thought is that this person is reckless, rude, or simply a bad driver, a judgment about their character delivered in less than a second. Days later, running late for an appointment, you cut into a lane yourself without signalling, and the explanation that arrives just as automatically is entirely different. The traffic was bad, you were late, the circumstances forced your hand. The identical action, judged by character when a stranger performs it, and judged by circumstance when performed by oneself, is the signature of what social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. Lee Ross, who studied the pattern extensively in the 1970s, found it appearing across an enormous range of situations, from classroom debates to workplace evaluations, wherever an observer explained someone else's behaviour, by pointing to a stable trait of their character rather than to the specific situation that person happened to be in. The asymmetry runs in a predictable direction because of what each side can actually see. A driver cutting you off is to you only ever this one visible action, disconnected from whatever pressure or emergency might be shaping it, so the action itself has to carry the full explanation, and character is the easiest place to put it. Your own late arrival, by contrast, comes wrapped in a full internal narrative of traffic deadlines and bad luck that a stranger could never see. The error quietly poisons workplace evaluations, where an employee's single missed deadline gets filed under laziness, and family arguments, where a partner's short temper on one hard evening gets filed under permanent character rather than a single bad day. The same generosity toward context that each person reserves almost without exception, only for themselves. Psychologist Melvin Lernure, running a series of studies in the 1960s, showed participants a video of someone receiving electric shocks for no discernible fault of their own. Rather than simply feeling sympathy for an innocent person suffering, a striking share of participants instead began to describe the victim as somehow less admirable, less careful, or less deserving of respect than they had seemed before the shocks began, despite having done nothing whatsoever to bring the suffering on themselves. Lerner named the underlying belief the just world hypothesis, a deep, largely unconscious assumption that the world is basically fair and that people generally get what they deserve, good or bad. When a genuinely undeserved misfortune contradicts that comforting assumption, the mind has two options. It can accept that bad things sometimes happen to people who did nothing to cause them, which is unsettling because it means the same could happen to anyone, including the observer, or it can quietly adjust its view of the victim instead, finding some flaw, however minor or invented, That restores the sense that the world is still fair after all. Studies since Lerner's original work have found the same pattern behind victim-blaming responses to crime, poverty, and illness, where observers reach for explanations involving the victim's own choices or character long before they consider structural or simply random causes. The belief persists not because people are cruel, but because the alternative, a world genuinely indifferent to who deserves what, is a harder thing to hold in mind than a story, however unfair to the actual victim, that keeps the larger world feeling orderly and safe. A group of doctors is told that a particular surgical procedure has a 90% survival rate, and a large share recommend it to patients. A second group of doctors, given the identical statistic worded differently, is told the same procedure has a 10% mortality rate, and a noticeably smaller share recommend it, despite 90% survival and 10% mortality being mathematically the same fact stated two ways. This finding, from research by Kahneman and Tversky in the early 1980s, demonstrated the framing effect, the tendency for identical information to produce different decisions depending purely on how it is worded, independent of anything actually changing about the underlying facts. The word survival carries a hopeful frame that draws attention toward the outcome that goes right, while the word mortality carries a grim frame that draws attention toward the outcome that goes wrong, and the mind responds to whichever frame was handed to it, rather than doing the extra work of converting one into the other and checking they match. The effect shapes decisions well beyond medicine. A product advertised as 95% fat-free sounds considerably more appealing than the identical product advertised as containing 5% fat, even though the two descriptions describe exactly the same product. Political messaging leans on the same tool constantly, describing an identical policy as either a tax or a fee, a cut or a saving, depending entirely on which frame the messenger wants the audience reaching for first. The lesson the framing effect offers is not that framing is dishonest by nature, since every statement requires some frame or another. It is that whenever a decision seems to hinge on how something was worded, rather than on what it actually says, is quietly doing the deciding, is wording coming. Researchers at Harvard Business School in 2011 ran a simple experiment. They had one group of participants assemble a piece of plain flat-pack furniture themselves, and asked a second group, who had never touched a screwdriver in the process, to evaluate an identical, already assembled version of the same piece. Both groups were then asked how much they would pay for their respective piece. The people who had built their own furniture consistently valued it far more highly than the second group valued the identical, pre-built version, despite the two objects being functionally the same in every way, except who had spent the effort putting them together. Researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Mochon, and Dan Ariely named the pattern the Ikea effect, after the furniture retailer whose entire business is built on customers assembling their own purchases at home. The effort a person puts into creating something appears to attach itself to the finished object's perceived value, as though the labor becomes an ingredient baked into the thing itself, rather than simply a cost paid to obtain it. This explains why a home cook often rates a dish they spent hours preparing as tastier than an objectively similar dish bought ready-made, and why a parent's homemade birthday card, however imperfect the drawing, holds a value in a child's eyes that no store-bought equivalent could match. Businesses have learned to use the effect deliberately leaving small amounts of assembly, customization, or setup work for the customer to complete, since a customer who has invested even a little of their own effort into a product tends to feel a stronger attachment to it than a customer who received the identical result fully finished and effortless. In a grocery store in California, researchers set up a tasting table on different days offering either 6 flavors of jam or 24 flavors of jam. The larger display drew more browsers, curious about the wider selection stopping to sample. But when it came time to actually buy, the shoppers who had browsed the smaller display of 6 flavors were roughly 10 times more likely to make a purchase than the shoppers who had browsed the larger display of 24. Psychologist Sheena E. Youngar, who ran the study in 2000, and B. Schwartz, who later expanded the idea into a widely read book, called the pattern the paradox of choice. Past a certain point, more options make a decision harder rather than easier, and the added difficulty leaves people more likely to walk away having decided nothing at all rather than risk choosing badly among so many possibilities. The paradox appears to work through two separate mechanisms. First, comparing many options requires real cognitive effort, and that effort itself becomes a cost the shopper must weigh against however small the reward for choosing correctly turns out to be. Second, a large set of options increases the chance of regret after the fact, since choosing one flavor from 24 leaves 23 unchosen alternatives to wonder about, while choosing one from 6 leaves only 5, a far smaller pool for regret to draw from. Modern life offers Iyengar's jam table constantly and at far larger scale, in dating apps offering thousands of potential matches, streaming services offering endless catalogues, and retirement plans offering dozens of nearly identical fund options, each one quietly recreating the same experiment, and often producing the identical result: overwhelmed browsing, followed by no decision at all. An excellent salesperson, consistently the top performer on their team, gets promoted to sales manager as a reward for that performance, and discovers that managing a team of salespeople draws on an entirely different set of skills than making sales calls ever did. If the promotion goes badly, there is usually no further promotion coming, and the salesperson, once excellent at their old job, now occupies a role they are not especially good at, with no obvious next step in either direction. Educator Lorenz Peter described exactly this pattern in a 1969 book, arguing, half as satire and half as genuine observation, that employees in a hierarchy tend to rise through a series of promotions triggered by success in their current role, and that this process continues only until they reach a role at which they are no longer competent, at which point the promotions simply stop and they remain there. Peter summarized the resulting principle bluntly. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to their level of incompetence. The mechanism is almost structural rather than a matter of bad luck, since organizations routinely use performance in the current role as their main evidence for readiness in the next role, even though the skills that made someone excellent at one level, technical mastery, individual output, close attention to detail, are often precisely the skills least relevant to the very different demands of managing other people doing that same work. Peter's original observation was written with a satirist's exaggeration, but organizational researchers since have found real evidence of the pattern in large datasets of actual promotions, suggesting that a great many organizations are, quietly and by their own design, staffed one level past where their best people were actually the most useful. A particular lottery has odds of roughly 1 in 300 million for any single ticket, and yet somewhere, almost every drawing, a single winning old, and the news reports it as an astonishing stroke of fortune. Both things are true at once. Any single person's odds really are vanishingly small, and yet across the enormous number of tickets sold across the entire population playing that lottery, someone winning eventually becomes not just likely but close to certain. This is the law of large numbers at work, a mathematical principle stating that across a sufficiently large number of independent trials, even an extremely rare event becomes highly likely to occur somewhere within that large pool, purely as a matter of arithmetic rather than any special luck attaching itself to the eventual winner. The principle explains why freak coincidences, seemingly impossible in isolation, occur regularly across a population large enough to generate enough attempts. Given enough people flipping coins, someone will eventually flip 10 heads in a row, not because that particular person is unusually fortunate, but because enough flips were happening somewhere in the pool for a 10 in a row streak to become statistically expected rather than miraculous. Disease clusters offer a less cheerful example of the same math. Given enough neighborhoods across a country, a handful of them will, by pure chance, show an unusually high rate of a particular illness in a given year, and residents searching for a cause in the local environment or water supply are often searching for an explanation that a purely random arithmetic clustering has already fully provided. The law of large numbers does not remove meaning from every rare event. It only insists that rarity, once multiplied by a sufficiently large number of chances, stops being quite as rare as it looks from inside any single instance of it. A group of comedians and writers, gathering for decades at a New York delicatessen called Lindy's near Broadway, developed a running theory about which shows playing nearby were likely to have long runs and which would close quickly. Their rule of thumb was simple. A show that had already been running for 100 days had, statistically, a better expected remaining run than a show that had only been running for 10, because survival itself was evidence of durability. The essayist Nassim Nicholas Taleb later formalized and named this observation the Lindy effect, applying it well beyond Broadway to any non-perishable thing whose future life expectancy tends to grow, rather than shrink, the longer it has already lasted. A technology, an idea, or a book that has survived for centuries has already outlasted countless newer competitors that seemed promising in their own time and quietly vanished, and that survival is itself a form of evidence, harder to fake than any single glowing review, that the thing has something durable going for it. A book published 50 years ago and still widely read today is, by Lindy logic, more likely to still be read in another 50 years than a book published last month and currently fashionable, since the old book has already survived exactly the kind of forgetting that claims most new books quickly. The Lindy effect explicitly does not apply to things with a natural known lifespan, like a living person or a piece of fruit, where age moves a thing closer to its end rather than further from it. It applies specifically to ideas, institutions, and non-perishable objects, where the passage of time is not a countdown toward expiration but an ongoing test that most things quietly fail, leaving the survivors, by virtue purely of having survived, worth taking seriously. A human bone placed under moderate repeated stress through exercise does not merely survive that stress, it responds by growing measurably denser and stronger than a bone left unstressed and idle, a property biologists have understood for a long time, and one the essayist Nassim Nicholas Taleb used as his central example when he set out to name something he felt existing language lacked a word for. Resilient things, he pointed out, resist damage and return to their original state afterward. Fragile things break under stress and cannot recover. But a third category exists that neither word quite captures. Things that actually improve, becoming stronger or better, specifically because of exposure to stress, shock and disorder, rather than merely surviving it. Taleb coined the word anti-fragile for this third category in a 2012 book. The immune system offers another clear example, since moderate exposure to pathogens is precisely what trains it to respond more effectively to future ones, meaning a body raised in complete sterile isolation from every germ would, counterintuitively, end up far more vulnerable than one that faced ordinary, survivable exposure along the way. Some human systems display the same property. A small business that survives several minor cash flow crises often emerges with better financial discipline and more resilient habits than a business that never faced any adversity at all, and consequently never developed the muscles for handling it. The deliberate practical implication Taleb draws from this is not to seek out maximum chaos, since genuine catastrophe destroys rather than strengthens anything caught inside it. It is to design systems, whether a body, a business, or a career, so that ordinary, survivable volatility has somewhere useful to go, building strength through exactly the kind of stress that a purely fragile system would have no way to absorb. Picture an investor with $100,000, choosing between placing the entire sum in moderately risky assets or splitting it in an unusual way. $90,000 in the safest instruments available and $10,000 in the riskiest, highest potential bets they can find, avoiding the entire middle range of moderate risk in between. This second approach, called the Barbell Strategy after the shape of weights concentrated at two extreme ends rather than spread evenly along a bar, was popularized in the same body of writing that produced Anti-Fragility, and for a closely related reason. The moderate middle ground of risk is, in this view, the most dangerous place to concentrate resources, because moderate risk is large enough to cause real, sometimes ruinous damage if it goes badly, while rarely being large enough to produce a transformative upside if it goes well. The 90% placed in extreme safety ensures that even a catastrophic outcome for the risky 10% cannot meaningfully threaten the investor's overall position, while the small risky slice retains the chance, however unlikely on any given attempt, of an outsized payoff that a purely moderate strategy would never have been positioned to capture. The logic extends past finance. A person structuring their career might spend the large majority of their time in stable, reliable work while deliberately reserving a small portion of time or energy for a genuinely uncertain creative or entrepreneurial project, one large enough to matter if it succeeds but small enough, in terms of time and resources committed, that its failure costs relatively little. The barbell does not promise to avoid loss entirely, since the small risky end can, and often does, lose everything placed in it. It promises only that losing that small end will never take the whole structure down with it, which is precisely the promise the comfortable moderate middle can rarely make. A policy position that would have ended a politician's career if voiced in public 30 years ago can, today, sit comfortably inside mainstream debate, discussed calmly by people who consider themselves entirely moderate. Nothing about the position itself necessarily changed. What changed is a boundary policy analyst Joe Zoof Overton described in the 1990s. The range of ideas a given society considers acceptable to say out loud at a given moment, a range now commonly called the Overton window. Ideas sitting inside the window get treated as reasonable, debatable positions that a serious person might genuinely hold. Ideas sitting outside it get treated as extreme, fringe, or simply unthinkable, regardless of the actual arguments that might be made for them. The window is not fixed, and it does not move only by persuading people at its centre. According to the theory named after Overton, the window most often shifts because someone voices a position at its extreme edge, a position too radical for mainstream acceptance at the time, and that extreme position, simply by being stated repeatedly and surviving in public discourse, makes the previously unthinkable position next door to it start to look comparatively moderate by contrast. Positions that once sat safely in the window's centre can be pushed outside it by the same mechanism running in reverse, becoming unthinkable to voice long after they were once ordinary. Advocacy groups on every side of political debate have explicitly used this theory to justify voicing deliberately extreme positions, not because they expect those exact positions to be adopted, but because doing so is intended to drag the window itself, and with it what counts as reasonable some distance in their preferred direction. Why does a committee tasked with approving the design of a nuclear power plant sometimes spend far more meeting time debating the paint colour of the staff bicycle shed than debating the reactor's actual safety systems? The scenario, sketched by the same writer who described Parkinson's law of expanding tasks, illustrates a related observation now called bike shedding, or formerly Parkinson's law of triviality. The reactor design is enormously important, but it is also enormously complex, requiring specialized expertise that most committee members do not have, which makes any individual member reluctant to speak up, question, or challenge the details for fear of revealing their own limited understanding of something so technical. The bicycle shed, by contrast, is a trivial matter that every single person on the committee feels fully qualified to have an opinion about, and having an opinion about it, unlike the reactor, carries no risk of embarrassment. The predictable result is a group that races through the decision that actually matters with barely a comment, then spends an hour arguing passionately over paint colour, precisely because the paint colour is the one part of the meeting where everyone feels safe contributing. The pattern shows up constantly outside literal committee rooms. A company redesigning its entire strategy can find employees strangely quiet during the strategic discussion, only to erupt into passionate, prolonged debate the moment the conversation turns to the wording of a company memo or the choice of font on a new sign. The trivial decision is not more important than the significant one. It is simply more comfortable, and comfort in a room full of people avoiding the risk of looking uninformed tends to win far more meeting time than the stakes could ever justify. In 2003, an aerial photographer taking pictures of California's coastline for an environmental documentation project included, among thousands of images, a photograph of a large hillside home belonging to the entertainer Barbra Streisand. Streisand's legal team sued to have the single photograph removed from public access, citing privacy concerns. Before the lawsuit, the photograph had reportedly been downloaded only a handful of times from an obscure environmental archive almost nobody visited. Within a month of the lawsuit becoming public news, the photograph had been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people, reposted across the growing internet, and preserved permanently on websites specifically dedicated to documenting attempts at censorship. The lawsuit intended to remove the image from public attention had instead guaranteed it would circulate far more widely than it ever would have on its own. Media commentator Nick coined the term Streisand Effect a few years later to describe this exact dynamic. An attempt to suppress, hide, or censor a piece of information can itself generate the curiosity and attention that ensures the information spreads wider than it would have if left alone. The effect has since repeated itself many times over, as companies and public figures have discovered that a legal threat or takedown demand aimed at an unflattering piece of content frequently draws vastly more attention to that content than it ever received before the threat was made public, particularly once the threat itself becomes newsworthy in its own right. The lesson embedded in the effect is an uncomfortable one for anyone trying to make something disappear. On a network built for sharing, the visible act of trying to hide something has become, itself, one of the most reliable ways to guarantee that it gets found. In Lewis Carroll's story of Alice's journey through the looking glass, the Red Queen tells Alice that in her strange country, it takes all the running one can do just to stay in the same place. Biologist Lee Van Valen, studying patterns of extinction and adaptation in the fossil record during the 1970s, borrowed the Red Queen's line to describe something he noticed happening constantly between competing species. A predator that evolves to run marginally faster does not gain any lasting advantage over its prey, because the prey population, under the exact same evolutionary pressure to survive being caught, evolves to run marginally faster too, and the relative gap between predator and prey ends up back where it started, despite both species having genuinely improved. Neither side is any better off than before the arms race began, and yet neither side can afford to stop running, because the moment one side stops improving, the other, still improving, pulls decisively ahead. Van Valen called this the Red Queen effect, and it describes a strikingly common shape of competition that continues well past biology. Companies in a competitive industry often improve their products, cut their prices, or increase their marketing constantly, not because doing so provides any lasting advantage over their closest rivals, who are matching every move almost immediately, but because a company that simply stops running gets overtaken by the ones who never did. Professionals in fast-moving fields report the identical exhaustion, constantly acquiring new skills and credentials not to get ahead of their peers, most of whom are acquiring the identical skills at the identical pace, but simply to avoid falling behind a field that refuses to hold still. The exhausting part of a Red Queen race is not that nobody is winning. It is that everybody running is, by definition, required to run just as hard merely to keep losing at the same rate as before. The very first telephone ever built was, by itself, an entirely useless object, since there was no second telephone anywhere for it to call. The second telephone made the first one modestly useful, capable of one single connection. But a network of 100 telephones is not simply 100 times more useful than a single telephone, because each of those 100 phones can now potentially connect to 99 others, and the total number of possible connections across the whole network grows far faster than the number of phones added to it. Engineer Robert Metcalfe, who helped develop early networking technology in the 1970s, proposed a rule of thumb capturing this growth. The value of a communications network grows roughly with the square of the number of people connected to it, meaning a network twice as large in membership can become considerably more than twice as valuable to everyone already inside it. Metcalfe's law explains why early adopters of a new communication technology, whether the telephone, the fax machine, or a modern social media platform, often experience the technology as nearly worthless for a long stretch, since there are simply too few other people to connect with, and why the same technology can then appear to become indispensable almost overnight, once enough people cross a threshold and join. It also explains why dominant platforms in any given category are so difficult to unseat by a superior competitor, since a new platform, however well designed, starts with none of the accumulated network value that makes the incumbent worth using in the first place, leaving users reluctant to switch even when the alternative is, on every individual feature, genuinely better. The value being defended in these cases is rarely the product itself. It is the web of other people already standing inside it. Imagine a shared pasture open to any herder in the surrounding village to graze their animals on without restriction. Each individual herder, deciding whether to add one more animal to their own herd, weighs the full benefit of that extra animal against only a small fraction of the cost, since the pasture's slow degradation from overgrazing gets shared across every herder using it, while the profit from the additional animal goes entirely to the herder who added it. Rational self-interest, applied by every herder individually, points toward adding just one more animal, and then one more after that, and the same reasoning holds for every other herder sharing the same pasture at the same time. The result, once enough herders have each made the individually sensible choice, is a pasture destroyed by overgrazing that leaves every herder, including the ones who exercise the most restraint, worse off than if some shared limit had been agreed upon and enforced from the start. Ecologist Garrett Hardin popularized this scenario in a widely read 1968 essay, naming it The Tragedy of the Commons and pointing to real shared resources, ocean fisheries, groundwater, clean air, that face the identical structural problem. Individually rational use of a resource nobody exclusively owns can collectively exhaust the resource that everyone using it actually depends on. The same structure recurs at far smaller scale. In a shared office refrigerator that nobody individually feels responsible for cleaning, or a shared team email inbox that nobody feels individually responsible for organizing, each person's small individual convenience quietly degrading a resource the whole group needs. Solutions that have actually worked, studied extensively by economist E. Lin or O. S. Trum, decades after Hardin's original essay, tend to involve either clear enforced ownership or a community-managed set of shared rules, since a commons left entirely to individual rational self-interest, Hardin's essay argued, rarely survives its own users for very long. Two people are arrested and held separately, unable to communicate with one another, each facing an identical offer from investigators. If both stay silent, both receive a light sentence. If one betrays the other by testifying against them while the other stays silent, the betrayer walks free and the silent one receives a harsh sentence. If both betray each other, both receive a moderate sentence, worse than if they had both simply stayed silent. Mathematicians Mayerol Flood and Melvin Drescher devised this exact scenario at the Rand Corporation in 1950 while studying strategic decision-making, and a colleague, Albert Tukaya, later gave it the vivid framing of two prisoners that made it famous well beyond mathematics. Working through the logic from either prisoner's individual perspective reveals something uncomfortable. No matter what the other prisoner decides to do, betraying them is always the individually better choice, since betrayal improves the outcome whether the other person stays silent or also betrays. Both prisoners, reasoning entirely rationally and entirely selfishly, therefore arrive at mutual betrayal, the one outcome that leaves them both worse off than if they had simply trusted each other and stayed silent. The prisoner's dilemma became one of the founding puzzles of game theory, precisely because it shows individually sound reasoning producing a collectively bad result, a structure that recurs far beyond any actual prison. Two competing businesses locked in a price war, each individually better off cutting prices regardless of what the other does, can both end up with lower profits than if neither had cut prices at all. Nations locked in an arms race, each individually safer building more weapons regardless of the other's choice, can both end up less secure than if neither had built anything, having spent enormous resources achieving exactly the same relative balance they started with. Trust, in every one of these structures, is not merely a nice quality to have, it is the one ingredient capable of turning a guaranteed mutual loss back into a mutual gain. How long should a person spend choosing between two nearly identical jars of pasta sauce on a grocery shelf? Almost nobody would deliberate for more than a few seconds, because the difference between the two jars is small enough that any reasonable choice will turn out fine, and the time spent comparing them further would cost more, in a very real sense, than the improvement in outcome that further comparison could possibly deliver. Decision researchers have found that this same arithmetic quietly applies to far weightier choices too, and that people routinely fail to apply it where it matters most. A person choosing between two similar job offers, two similar apartments, or two similar romantic partners can spend weeks or months in careful comparison, listing advantages and disadvantages, seeking more information, delaying a decision that, past a certain point, additional deliberation is statistically unlikely to meaningfully improve. This is analysis paralysis, the point at which further thought stops helping and starts merely delaying, while the delay itself carries its own real cost in missed opportunities, in accumulated stress, and in the simple fact that a good enough choice made today is very often worth more than a marginally better choice arrived at 6 months from now. Every model in this list, in its own way, exists to shorten exactly this kind of stall. Recognizing a sunk cost lets a person stop defending money already spent. Recognizing an anchor lets a person notice a numbers grip before it decides the outcome on its own. Recognizing the shape of a decision, whatever shape it turns out to be, is what lets a mind stop circling and finally choose. None of these models make the choosing effortless. They only make it a little faster to arrive at, which, most days quietly, turns out to be enough. None of the models in this list are laws in the way gravity is a law. They are patterns noticed and named by people who were paying unusually close attention to the ordinary business of choosing, and like all patterns they hold only most of the time, in most of the cases, for most people. That is not a weakness in them. It is the whole reason they are useful, because a rule that held everywhere, for everyone, without exception, would not need naming at all. It would simply be how things are, invisible the way water is invisible to a fish. A short list of these patterns will not make the next decision easier in any dramatic way. The rent will still be due, the job offer will still need answering by Friday, the argument with someone you love will still need one of you to speak first. What changes, if anything changes, is smaller than that. It is the half second before a choice, in which a familiar shape now has a name, and a name is sometimes enough to make a person pause before running the reflex all the way to its usual end. Maybe you will notice the fence before you remove it, or the sunk cost before you defend it, or the crowd before you follow it without checking whether the crowd itself is only following someone else who is guessing. Maybe you will not notice anything at all, most of the time, because that is also how minds work, and no list changes that. We began by saying that your choices arrive looking like conclusions rather than decisions. They will keep arriving that way tomorrow, and the day after, mostly unremarked, mostly fine. But somewhere in the pile of ordinary choosing ahead of you, one of these 45 small patterns will surface at exactly the moment it matters, and you will recognize it. That is the whole and modest promise of everything you have just heard. Thank you for listening, and for giving these quiet mechanisms the 2 hours it takes to finally be introduced.